On a quiet summer morning in June 2009, a black Nissan Sentra was pulled from the waters of the Rideau Canal in Kingston, Ontario. Inside were 4 bodies, 3 young sisters and a woman in her 50s. To the officers who first peered through the shattered glass and murky water, the sight was chilling. 4 lives had ended together, trapped in a vehicle that seemed out of place, positioned oddly at the bottom of the canal. What began as a recovery operation would soon unravel into one of Canada's most disturbing true crime stories. The Shafia family had only been in Canada for a short time, having fled from Afghanistan and later lived in Dubai before seeking stability in North America. On the surface, they represented resilience and success. Mohammed Shafia, the patriarch, had built his wealth in business and was eager to present his family as prosperous immigrants. They lived in a large home in Montreal, drove expensive vehicles, and spoke of ambition and opportunity. To neighbors and acquaintances, they seemed like a family determined to make their mark in their new country. Yet beneath that polished exterior, the Shafia household was a place of deep division, suffocating control, and a growing rebellion from within. The sisters, Zainab, Sahar, and Gidi, were bright, spirited, and curious about the world around them. Like most teenagers, they wanted to dress in the latest fashions, enjoy the freedom of school life, and form friendships and relationships beyond the boundaries of home. They were drawn to music, movies, and boys, eager to fit into the culture of their peers. But every step they took toward independence was seen by their father as defiance. In his eyes, they were not simply disobedient daughters, they were a threat to the honor of the family. Honor was the invisible law that governed the Shafia household. It was not written down, but it was enforced with strict rules and unrelenting pressure. To disobey was to shame the family name, to stain a reputation that had been carefully guarded through generations. Muhammad believed that the family's dignity rested on the obedience and purity of its women. The daughter's small acts of rebellion, secret phone calls, makeup hidden in backpacks, friendships with boys, were not harmless teenage behavior, in his view, but dangerous steps toward dishonor. The tension inside the home was not always visible to outsiders, but it weighed heavily on the daughters. Teachers and social workers noticed signs of distress. The girls sometimes confided in friends, revealing the fear they lived with daily. Zainab, the eldest, bore the heaviest burden. She longed to live her own life, even attempting to escape, briefly, but her choices were met with rage and humiliation from her family. Sahar and Gidi followed in her footsteps, pushing against the limits set for them, each step deepening the rift between father and daughters. The 4th body in the car belonged to Rona, the quiet and sorrowful first wife of Mohammed Shafia. Trapped in a polygamous marriage that left her isolated and powerless, she had been forced to live in the shadows. Though her presence was barely acknowledged by the family, she formed a close bond with the daughters. She was both a confidant and a silent witness to the struggles they endured. Her life, like theirs, became entangled in a dangerous storm of tradition, control, and defiance. When the car was dragged from the water, no one yet understood the depth of this tragedy. It was not just the story of a single family, but the clash of 2 worlds. Old traditions that demanded obedience, and a new society that promised freedom. That night at the canal was not an accident. It was the culmination of years of fear, resentment, and a desperate struggle for independence. And as investigators would soon discover, the truth behind those 4 lives lost would shake an entire nation. Mohammed Shafia had worked hard to construct the image of a successful man. He carried himself with pride, spoke of wealth, and emphasized the opportunities he had created for his family by moving them to Canada. His home in Montreal was large, his cars expensive, and his reputation in the Afghan community carefully maintained. To many, he seemed a model of ambition and discipline. Yet inside the walls of his house, the reality was far from the polished mask he showed to the world. His rules were unyielding, his temper unpredictable, and his belief in family honor absolute. The daughters felt the heavy weight of this image every day. For them, life was a constant balancing act between the freedom they craved and the restrictions imposed on them. Zainab, the eldest, often tested the limits most openly. She wanted to wear clothes that reflected her personality, not just her father's rules. She wanted friendships that extended beyond the narrow boundaries of her culture. To her father, these were unforgivable acts of defiance. The shame of having a daughter seen as disobedient or too Western cut deeper for him than any financial loss could. His honor was not only personal, it was cultural, bound tightly to centuries of tradition that defined women's roles in society. Tuba, his second wife and the legal spouse under Canadian law, was caught in the middle. Outwardly, she played the role of loyal wife, often echoing her husband's beliefs and supporting his strict discipline. Yet, beneath that obedience lay a complicated dynamic. She was both victim and enforcer, often torn between protecting her daughters and maintaining her husband's trust. At times, she stood with the children, offering comfort and small acts of kindness. At other times, she joined her husband in condemning their behavior, choosing loyalty to him over love for them. It was this wavering allegiance that left the girls feeling even more isolated, never fully sure if their mother was a safe refuge or another obstacle. Then there was Hamed, the eldest son, who had grown into the role of his father's confidant. He learned quickly that obedience was rewarded and loyalty to Muhammad meant privilege. Over time, he became an extension of his father's authority. When his sisters disobeyed, it was often Hamed who watched, reported, and enforced discipline. His loyalty was seen not just as duty, but as a way to preserve the family's reputation in the eyes of others. To him, the girls' rebellion was not only disloyalty to their father, but also betrayal of the entire family structure. The conflicts escalated quietly, often hidden from public view. The daughters' choices grew bolder, and with each act, the anger within the household deepened. Sahar and Geeti, younger than Zainab, followed her path with their own expressions of defiance. They experimented with makeup, formed friendships with classmates, and dreamed of lives that reflected the freedom of the country they lived in. These acts, so ordinary in a Canadian setting, were interpreted inside their home as deliberate shames brought upon the family. The Shafias maintained their public image carefully. At social gatherings, they smiled, spoke of success, and never revealed the turmoil within. Neighbors saw an affluent family, but they could not hear the arguments that echoed in the night. Teachers observed bright, capable girls, but they did not witness the fear those girls carried home. The contrast between what was shown to the world and what happened privately could not have been greater. The invisible law of honor dictated everything. For Muhammad, dishonor was a stain that spread quickly and destroyed reputations. His daughter's behavior was more than rebellion. It was a threat to the family's name, one that could not be ignored or forgiven. In his mind, control was slipping, and with it, the very foundation of his authority. As the days passed, the gap between father and daughters grew wider. The image of respectability he had built began to feel fragile, vulnerable to the choices of his own children. In his world, the family's honor was everything, and he believed there could only be one way to protect it. The summer of 2009 carried a deceptive calm for the Shafia family. On the surface, it looked like a season of ordinary routines: family trips, drives between Montreal and Ontario, the appearance of unity. But beneath that normality, there were signs of planning and tension that no one outside the home could see. Zainab had already tested her limits by attempting to leave once before, bringing shame in her father's eyes and convincing him she could no longer be controlled. Sahar and Geeti followed with their own small acts of defiance, desperate for freedom. Rona, the first wife, had become more than just a witness. She was the confidant who heard the girls' frustrations and their fears. It was clear the pressure inside the family was reaching a breaking point. The trip that began in late June was framed as a family outing to Niagara Falls. Such trips were not unusual, and to anyone watching, there was nothing to suggest danger. Yet the movements of the family that night would later appear suspicious to investigators. They rented a second vehicle, an action that seemed unnecessary. They drove late into the night, covering distances that made little sense for a family, simply on vacation. The daughters were quiet, subdued, traveling in the Nissan Sentra with Rona. Whether they suspected what awaited them or believed it was another strict family outing remains unknown. What is certain is that none of them would return alive. In the early hours of June 30th, the black Nissan was found submerged in the Rideau Canal near Kingston. The discovery was first seen as a possible accident. 4 people drowned together, trapped in a car that had somehow veered off the road. But from the very beginning, small details raised doubts. The vehicle had entered the water at a location that was difficult to reach by mistake. There were no tire marks on the grass to suggest sudden braking or an attempt to avoid danger. The car seemed placed in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Inside the vehicle, the arrangement of the bodies puzzled authorities. The 3 teenage sisters and Rona appeared as though they had been caught in an unnatural stillness. None of them were strapped into seatbelts. Their positions suggested they may not have been aware of what was about to happen, or worse, that they had been incapacitated before the plunge into the water. The absence of struggle inside the car was as troubling as the crash itself. If this had been a frantic accident, there should have been signs of panic, broken nails, claw marks, or desperate attempts to escape. Instead, the car told a different story, one of silence. The family members who were not in the car explained the deaths as a tragic misfortune. They told authorities the girls had gone for a late-night drive and never returned. Their grief appeared convincing to some at first, but the inconsistencies in their timeline began to emerge almost immediately. Why would 4 family members leave on their own in the middle of the night? Why was a rental vehicle needed when they already had several cars? And why was Rona, often excluded and ignored in daily life, suddenly placed with the daughters in the same car? Police began to suspect that this was no accident. The canal became a crime scene rather than the site of a mishap. The Shafia's story, already fragile, began to unravel with every question asked. What had seemed like a tragedy of chance was now starting to look like a carefully orchestrated plan. The night had been chosen, the victims separated, and the vehicle submerged with chilling precision. Investigators could not yet prove what had happened, but the seeds of suspicion were firmly planted. What lay beneath the surface of the canal was more than just a sunken car. It was the first piece of evidence in a case that would expose the depths of control, fear, and obsession with honor inside the Shafia family. The facade of respectability was beginning to crack, and soon the truth would rise as unavoidably as the bodies pulled from the water. First cracks in the Shafia's account appeared almost immediately. Investigators who examined the car noticed details that did not fit the picture of a late-night accident. The vehicle's condition, the absence of skid marks, and the way it rested in the canal raised questions that demanded answers. As police retraced the family's movements, they discovered evidence that suggested more than coincidence. Surveillance cameras along highways and near the canal revealed unusual patterns of driving, including the presence of a second vehicle rented by the family. What began as quiet suspicion grew into the certainty that this was not an accident, but a deliberate act. The investigation turned inward, focusing on the household itself. Interviews with teachers, social workers, and friends of the daughters painted a picture of a family in turmoil. The girls had spoken of strict rules, of feeling trapped, and of their longing for freedom. There were reports of missed school days, emotional outbursts, and desperate cries for help that hinted at abuse behind closed doors. Each testimony deepened the growing narrative that the deaths were connected to control, fear, and a clash between 2 worlds: the daughter's desire for independence and the parents' obsession with honor. As detectives sifted through the Shafia's home, one discovery proved pivotal. Hidden recordings captured Mohammed Shafia in conversations that left little doubt about his feelings. On those tapes, he expressed relief, even satisfaction, that his daughters were gone, declaring it was better to lose them than endure the disgrace he believed they had brought. These words stripped away any lingering doubts about his motives. They revealed a mindset where the preservation of reputation outweighed the value of human life. The story of Rona, the first wife, also emerged, through evidence that had long been buried. In her diary, she documented years of sorrow and fear, writing about her place in a marriage where she was treated as invisible. She recorded the daughters' struggles, their hopes for freedom, and their growing terror that they would face consequences for defying their father. These pages became a voice for the silenced, offering a glimpse into a household where love was overshadowed by domination and fear. Forensic evidence tied the case together. The rented car placed the suspects near the canal on the night of the deaths. Marks on the Sentra suggested it had been pushed rather than driven into the water. Cell phone records contradicted the family's timeline, revealing activity that could not be explained by their version of events. Each new piece of evidence added weight to the theory of a planned killing, orchestrated with care but betrayed by details that could not be hidden. As the investigation widened, it became clear that this was not only a crime against 4 women, but a crime rooted in an ideology. The concept of honor, twisted into justification for violence, had driven the actions that led to their deaths. The daughter's only fault was wanting the same freedoms as their peers. Rona's only crime was existing as a reminder of a past the family no longer valued. What had first appeared to be a tragic accident was now exposed as a calculated act of murder. The facade of family respectability crumbled under the weight of recordings, diaries, and forensic proof. The Shafia's narrative collapsed, replaced by a chilling truth. The killings were deliberate, planned, and justified in the minds of those who carried them out. The case had moved beyond suspicion. It was no longer a question of whether this was a crime, but how such a crime could have been conceived and executed within a family that outwardly seemed ordinary. The focus now shifted to the courtroom, where the full story would be laid bare for the world to hear. The trial that followed became one of the most closely watched in Canadian history. In a packed courtroom, the story of the Shafia family was laid bare, every detail dissected before a jury and the public. Prosecutors argued that the deaths of Zainab, Sahar, Gidi, and Rona were not an accident, but a coldly calculated act of murder carried out to restore a family's sense of honor. The defendants, Mohammed Shafia, his wife Tuba, and their son Hamed, sat in the dock as evidence revealed the chilling sequence of events that led to 4 lives ending in the Rideau Canal. The prosecution relied heavily on the evidence investigators had painstakingly gathered. Surveillance footage tracked the family's movements on the night of the deaths. Forensic experts testified that the Nissan Sentra had not simply slipped into the water, but had been pushed with deliberate force. Cell phone records contradicted alibis, placing the accused near the scene at the crucial time. The recordings of Mohammed Shafia were played aloud, his words echoing through the courtroom with devastating clarity. He had spoken of his daughters as if they were burdens, celebrating their deaths as necessary to cleanse the family name. These recordings stripped away any attempt to portray the tragedy as misfortune. Witnesses added to the story, painting a picture of years of control, fear, and desperation. Teachers described girls who showed signs of distress, girls who sometimes confided about strict rules and their longing for freedom. Friends recalled whispered conversations about secret boyfriends, makeup hidden away, and the terror of discovery. Social workers recounted missed opportunities to intervene, moments when the girls had reached out but their voices were drowned by family authority. Each testimony built the case that these deaths were not sudden or unexpected, but the tragic culmination of years of repression. The defense argued that the deaths were accidental, pointing to the lack of direct eyewitnesses and suggesting that inconsistencies in the evidence left room for doubt. They claimed the family had been victims of cultural misunderstanding, that harsh words recorded in secret did not equal intent to kill. But the weight of evidence was too great. The diaries of Rona, the patterns of deceit, and the undeniable proof of planning undermined every attempt to shift the narrative. When the jury delivered its verdict, the courtroom fell silent. Mohammed Shafia, Tuba Yahya, and Hamed Shafia were all found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. The ruling carried mandatory life sentences, with no chance of parole for 25 years. The decision sent shockwaves through the country. It was not only justice for the victims, but a reckoning with the cultural concept of honor that had been twisted into justification for violence. The case forced Canada and the wider world to confront the reality of honor killings within immigrant communities. It sparked debates about integration, women's rights, and the balance between respecting culture and protecting individuals. For many, It became a symbol of the dangers women face when tradition is used as a weapon. The names of Zainab, Sahar, Giti, and Rona became more than headlines. They became reminders of the price paid when control and reputation are valued above love and life. Though the courtroom doors eventually closed, the echoes of the case endured. It was not just a family on trial, but an entire belief system that placed honor above humanity. The story ensured that the voices silenced in the canal would never be forgotten, and their tragedy would continue to raise awareness long after the verdict was read.